Unit 9, Fashion and Status.
Today, everyone, as part of our look at fashion and design, we're going to take a look at fashion and social status. That is, how we use fashion to make statements about our social status, who we are, how wealthy we are, and so on. We do this with the kinds of cars we buy, the style of our houses, and, of course, the clothes we wear, which is the subject of today's discussion. Now, the idea of using special clothes to signify social status has a long history, dating back to ancient Egypt. In very hierarchical societies, like ancient Egypt, for example, only those in high positions could wear sandals. Also, the Greeks and Romans had laws which controlled the type, the color, and number of garments that could be worn, as well as the kind of embroidery used. These were known as sumptuary laws. That's sumptuary, sumptuary laws. However, as barriers between social classes became weaker, these so-called sumptuary laws became increasingly difficult to enforce and were eventually abandoned. Instead, high status was indicated by the cost of a person's clothing. You know, rich and exotic materials, expensive and often unnecessary accessories, and difficult to care for styles. This kind of expensive and often unnecessary clothing was designed to attract attention. It was an example of what's called conspicuous consumption. That's conspicuous consumption. And of course, people thought the type of clothes you wore reflected what you could afford. In other words, your clothes reflected your wealth. I'm going to be using this word conspicuous a lot today. Conspicuous basically means deliberately attracting attention. If you look at fashion today, things haven't really changed much, have they? Even though people these days don't dress in silver or gold lace, clothes are still very much a sign of status. In fact, you could say that nowadays, many people believe clothes tell us about the personality, the honesty, talent, and intelligence of the person wearing them. In some social circles, there's often a feeling that someone who's not well-dressed is probably dishonest or stupid and without talent. Now that's sad, but true, I'm afraid. Many of us make these judgments very quickly and unconsciously, which, of course, is why people read and write books with titles like Dress for Success. The idea is, if you dress well, people will judge you positively even before you open your mouth, right? I'd say that people have very definite ideas about dress and character. But today I'm going to look in detail at this idea of conspicuous consumption. So just to recap, let me repeat that conspicuous consumption is about the different ways we spend money in order to show people our wealth. And one of the most obvious ways we do this is by wearing more clothes than other people. This is sometimes called conspicuous addition. Whatever the occasion, the well-to-do normally wear more clothes. In North America, for instance, men are more likely to wear jackets and vests, and women pantyhose, scarves, and unnecessary but expensive wraps, even in midsummer. And on the beach, even though their swimsuits may be like everyone else's, just watch the wealthy put on their silk beach kimonos when they come out of the water, or maybe a shirt, hat, and bag that matches their swimsuit, and people notice, right? Of course, they're supposed to notice. That's the point. Of course, people also show off their status by wearing a lot of clothes consecutively, rather than simultaneously. In other words, as we've seen, people wear more clothes, but they also like to show off, to display as many different outfits as possible. Basically, the more outfits you wear, the higher your status. It's as simple as that. Now, how do people do this? Well, they divide daily life into different sorts of activity, what's been called conspicuous division. And each of these activities, such as going to work or going out to dinner, requires a different kind of clothing. Now, this isn't anything new. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, it was common for the wealthier classes to have different clothing for different parts of the day. Men would wear a morning suit, a dress coat, a dinner jacket, and women, morning clothes, walking clothes, tea gowns, motoring outfits, evening dresses, you name it, there was a costume for it. Now, today, we have the same tradition, but the emphasis is on sports rather than social life. Fashionable people have different outfits for different sports, whether it's jogging or hiking, or cycling, golf, or aerobics, and to wear the wrong outfit can cause a loss of prestige. This, by the way, is what enables manufacturers of sports equipment to make so much money. And it's not just having separate clothing that's important. It's also having the right equipment. That also has to be high prestige. It's important to have the correct brand names. Now, another way of indicating high status is to own many similar garments so that you rarely wear the same thing. This is what's known as conspicuous multiplication. For instance, some very wealthy men wear a brand new shirt every day. They'll never use the same shirt twice. Having a large, up-to-date wardrobe is especially important for men and women who want to establish themselves socially and professionally. Who want to make an impression. Once people know them, have made a decision about their status, it usually becomes less important. Teenagers, in particular, feel very strongly about showing variety in their dress. For example, teenage girls often feel so embarrassed about wearing the same outfit twice in the same week that even if they only own a few clothes, they'll try hard to make them seem new by combining them in different ways and with different accessories. They feel so strongly about this, in fact, that they'll often prefer quantity to quality. Now, let's move on to another form of conspicuous consumption, and I'm talking about the use of expensive materials, conspicuous materials. Now, in the past, materials such as satin and velvet were prestigious because they were hand-woven and required a lot of time and labor. But today, modern machinery's changed all that. The result is that natural materials, which are often more scarce, are now more prestigious. I'm talking about materials like silk, leather, wool. In today's world, natural is best. Artificial materials such as nylon and polyester were expensive and very fashionable when they first appeared, but as they became cheaper to produce, polyester became a dirty word, and now it's seen as the poor man's silk. You can also see a similar pattern with animal skins and pelts. Today, because wildlife's becoming scarcer, these things have gotten more expensive and therefore more prestigious, particularly the hides of animals like the alligator. In centuries past, however, when things were different, skins and pelts of more common animals were associated with peasants, shepherds, and hunters, even outlaws. To show their status, merchants wore robes trimmed with less common fur, such as beaver. Noblemen preferred sable, and kings and queens wore ermine. All, again, relatively rare materials, and therefore indicators of status. As you know, though, even though skins of wild animals are often prestigious in the sense of being rare and therefore expensive, today they're also seen as showing a disregard for the environment and wildlife. Okay, now another way people display their wealth is by wearing jewelry. High-priced stones and metals, particularly those like gold and diamonds, whose market price is generally known to be high. Gemstones such as rubies or emeralds, whose market price is less well known or which are more easily imitated, are less popular. Instant identification's desirable, you see. In other words, people need to be able to understand just by looking that something's expensive. And that's why platinum never really became very popular. Even though it's more expensive than gold, the problem was people couldn't easily tell it from silver or aluminum. Anyway, we call this display of expensive items conspicuous wealth. Next, we come to conspicuous labeling. Not long ago, you could recognize a high-quality, hand-tailored suit made in, say, London's Savile Row or Paris. Today, though, thanks to sophisticated manufacturing methods and artificial materials that look like the real thing, it's become very difficult to tell simply by looking whether a suit, a jacket, or whatever has been handmade using the finest natural materials and therefore whether it has cost far more than your average off-the-rack equivalent. In addition, more people than ever are wealthy. Together, these two things create a problem. It's almost impossible to distinguish the rich from the very rich simply by looking at what they're wearing. So how do the very rich show their status? Well, one way is by using labels to show expensive brands. Designers realized that high-status garments didn't need to be recognizably of better quality or more difficult to produce than other garments. They only needed to be recognizably more expensive. So they had to somehow include the price of each garment in the basic design. How did they do that? The answer is they moved the designer's name from the inside to the outside of the garment. Simple. Then they aggressively promoted these names and trademarks until they became household names. Now, the prices of these designer garments were not high because they were better quality, but because of the huge cost of advertising them. And people wearing these clothes would be sending out the message, I can afford to buy clothes made by this designer. In fact, people will happily buy inferior quality clothes if they're clearly labeled and everyone knows they are highly priced. And cotton t-shirts are a great example of this. They may fade quickly and shrink out of shape after just a few washings, but it doesn't matter. If they have the right designer name printed on them, people prefer them to better-made t-shirts. Apparently, they make the people who wear them feel secure. At least, that's what research indicates. Conspicuous labeling, then, was a radical but very effective solution to a rather difficult problem. Do you see how this works? Now, to wrap up, I'd like to mention two other kinds of conspicuous consumption in clothing to bring our total to 8 different types. One of these is conspicuous outrage. In other words, dressing which leads people to feel outrage, shock, if you like. Here, people purposely wear clothes that aren't in good taste, that others won't approve of, that don't conform. These clothes attract negative attention, but they get attention nonetheless. Now, the teenage punks of the 1980s were a good example of this, as are pop stars who turn up at formal events in torn or faded T-shirts with offensive language printed on them. Now, this brings me to the last type, what I call associative consumption, in which people wear items of clothing because they've acquired prestige through association with high-status individuals, such as royalty, like Princess Diana, or film stars. A good example of this is John Lennon's round glasses. These became a fashion icon, and even today people refer to round glasses as John Lennon glasses. Associative consumption also includes high-status activities. Just think of the clothing associated with horseback riding. Checked suits, glossy high-heeled boots, polo shirts, and waisted jackets. These items have the power of association. We may assume that the people wearing them ride and own horses and therefore have the money associated with these activities. The same's true of fashion goods associated with golfing and yachting. They all send out strong signals. Okay, so let's quickly review. We've said that conspicuous consumption's a way of signaling how wealthy we are, what status we have, and clothing's one way we do this. It's one way we consume conspicuously. I've mentioned conspicuous addition, meaning people wear more clothes to show their status. And then we looked at conspicuous division, where people wear different outfits at different times of the day or for different activities. And then there was conspicuous multiplication, where people have many garments of the same type. And then we considered conspicuous materials, in which people wear rare or expensive materials to show wealth, followed by conspicuous wealth, where people wear high-priced materials such as gold and diamonds, usually as accessories. And after that, we looked at conspicuous labeling, where garments are worn with their designer labels on the outside for everyone to see. Not too subtle, but it works. It says something. And finally, we looked at conspicuous outrage, where clothing is used to attract negative attention, where the intent is to shock people. And associative consumption, where clothing is associated with a celebrity or lifestyle. So you see, fashion really is a vehicle for self-expression, for saying, this is me and this is the kind of lifestyle I have. Can you match it? All right, everyone. Let's take a break there, and we'll start our seminar in 15 minutes, okay?